Yonsei University established the Institute for Global Engagement and Empowerment, or IGEE, in 2017 to promote sustainable development both globally and domestically. The Institute has been headed by our Honorary Director, Secretary General Ban-Ki-moon. Since then, we have organized the annual Global Engagement and Empowerment Forum, or GEEF, a major conference in which we strive to accomplish the UN SDGs. In addition to the annual GEEF, we are hosting a seminar series on the various and urgent topics of the SDGs, which we've named GEEF for All. And I'm pleased to have today's special conversation in our GEEF for All series. Due to the level 4 social distancing regulation against COVID-19, we have a time restriction, so let me just jump right in. Before we begin today's forum, let me introduce Colombian Ambassador to Korea, Ambassador Juan Carlos Caiza-Rosero, for his brief appreciation remarks. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Welcome, President Iván Duque, President of Colombia, President Su, President Mr. Ban Ki-moon. Welcome. I would like to welcome to all the delegation, ministries, the official delegation from private sector, students, professors, ambassadors. I would like to say two messages, President Duque. Yonsei University, in the middle of COVID-19, in March of the last year, support us, our country, in several kind of video conference, no, with the Ban Ki-moon Institute around health sector. The first video conference, we had the opportunity to share that video conference with the Instituto Nacional de Salud, with our Ministry of Health, around the test, the strategy of Korea test. A second message, President Duque, in this moment, Colombia and Korea, Yonsei University and Universidad Javeriana, Universidad Nacional, Universidad de los Andes, there are 3 MOUs. The objective I would like to invite to a work between the GEEF with these universities. This institute, President Duque, the goal of this institute is work around SDGs. I believe this objective with the University of Yonsei University and Korean University and the P4G scenario, that is with the same objective around SDGs, is a good opportunity to create a platform to work. Thank you so much.
Today's session is designed as a special conversation between the Secretary General and the President of Colombia, Dr. Iván Duque Marquez, who is on a state visit to South Korea. Congratulations again on your honorary doctoral degree from Yonsei, and now you are brand new Yonsei alumni. Congratulations. And now, please welcome Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and President Iván Duque. His Excellency Ban Ki-moon is a pioneer of climate action and SDGs, our honorary director of the IGEE, and distinguished chair professor of Yonsei, and the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations. The stage is yours.
First of all, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to see you again in person this year. This is a second time for us to meet this year only, but during last February, when there was a GEEF conversation, you participated through Zoom because of corona quarantine policies. But I'm very happy to see you in person, and congratulations for your very successful summit meeting with the President Moon Jae-in. And your visit at this time, during such a very difficult time, nobody is daring to travel. But you have come from a long way from Colombia to Korea. It has given a lot of sense of assurance and thanks and deep appreciation for your leadership. First of all, I was very much impressed and inspired by your very inspiring and ambitious and far-reaching visions, both on security, sustainable development, and peace around the world. In that regard, in fact, to tell you the truth, I was going to make one long speech today before we having this one, but because of the time limit, I was advised by our authorities for this quarantine policy. We may have to close this office by 6 p.m. So we have about half an hour. But I think we can cover all important issues within half an hour. So I'll just try to be very brief in my introduction remarks to you. But in any way, you touched virtually all the issues the United Nations has been dealing with and UN is going to deal with, including climate, security, and the development issues. Therefore, I'll try to limit this time. I'll begin by first some security-related issues. Then let's talk a little bit about the climate crisis, because this is about world peace and climate. Therefore, let me begin that I was very happy to hear that you had visited demilitarized zone. That is the only remaining legacy of Cold War. At the same time, I was very much happy while serving as a Secretary General. You Colombians made a great stride in resolving this 56-year-old conflict with the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. As a Secretary General, I also have been involved and trying to really promote and facilitate the dialogue between your government and FARC through the mediation of Cuban President Raul Castro. That is one thing which I feel very proud that I could do something for conflict resolution. In fact, the peace and security, development, human rights are three pillars. But there are still so many unresolved conflict areas. But you have solved this problem. And in that regard, I'd like to hear your views on what and how you were able to resolve this 57-year-old conflict with the FARC, then how and what kind of lessons we could learn from your experience to resolve Korean problems. Because President Moon Jae-in had 3 summit meetings with his counterpart in North, Kim Jong-un. Even President Trump, he had 2 meetings with him. And former presidents, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, they all visited North Korea and had their successful visit. Even President Kim Dae-jung, for his contribution, he received Nobel Peace Prize. But the end result is still the same, even worse. Our relationship between South and North Korea is still very delicate, I am, as a lifelong diplomat and also as a former Secretary General, I am very much frustrated and very much disappointed that we have not been able to resolve this one. So combining all this, your case and your feeling, which you have felt while visiting the demilitarized zone in Panmunjom this morning. So I'd like to have your views. What kind of lessons which we can, how your experience can be applied to our case? Floor is yours. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General. You were my boss at the UN, so you're now the boss in this panel. So I will definitely follow the rules that you have set. And thank you, because it is a great honor for me to be here with you. I've had professed deep admiration for you, and you have been to me in many ways sort of a mentor. I still remember when you all allowed me to join the flotilla panel at the UN. So thank you again for all the kindness that you have had with me. Mr. Secretary General, I want to make this reflection. Colombia signed peace with FARC, but FARC was not the only threat that we had from armed groups, because we still face threats with ALLN and with other drug cartels. So we must have that at a first sight. However, what is also important to say is that signing peace is the easiest part. The difficult part is implementing peace. The difficult part is implementing peace throughout the years. Why? Because it requires a budgetary commitment, an institutional commitment, and it deeply requires that some principles are met, especially the principles of truth, the principle of justice, the principle of reparation, and the principle of non-repetition. So the peace process with FARC was said to be implemented in 15 years. So I inherited, when I took office, a process that was in many ways weak. In other things, it was in the right direction. In some things, it was fragile. In other things, it was more consolidated. But definitely, the job of making it to last has to do with the implementation. So I believe that, for example, for former combatants, it is very important to push the transition for them to have a legal way of living. So we have provided Social Security, we have provided to them productive projects in a collective way and an individual way. We have made investments in 170 municipalities that were the most affected historically by violence and poverty, and those are called the Regional Focused Development Plans. We have 16 right now that are the route for the future in terms of social investment. But we have to do much more, for example, in land titling. We have to do much more in terms of bringing investment in those areas, and that's why we now have something that works for taxes. So companies can make public works in those spaces and not pay those same amount in taxes. Those are the things that are happening. And I think that has been working, but we still have the challenge that there are dissidencies. People who never committed truly to peace, who have been attacking social leaders, who have been attacking former combatants, and that's a challenge we have. But what I can take as a lesson from our experience is that this is something that has to be built daily. And this was a process between the legitimate state and an illegitimate force. So those are the challenges we face, and definitely, and you know this, if you have more coca, if you have more illegal crops, that affects peace building. Even though that we have reached the lowest homicide rates in 40 years, and that we have reached lowest rates in other kinds of crimes, we still have to see this work on a daily basis. Peace building requires to have long-term investment, and we have ensured that. And we have now a plan for the next 14 years in order to be successful. Now, you asked me whether I could give some sort of an advice to Korea, and I don't think it'll be wise from my standpoint to give advices, because I'm not an expert in the roots of the historical conflict. But I can tell something. I think the contrast that the world can see is the contrast between democracy and autocracy. The contrast between a free economy and a state-driven economy. The contrast of entrepreneurial spirit and the lack of entrepreneurial spirit. I think that comparison is evident for the whole world. Now, can that change in the future? It can, but it can only be done if there is a path to democracy in the other side of the border. So I think what has been done by the governments here in Korea has been wise, in a sense, to have dialogue, to have the possibility to maneuver over the dialogue. I think the demilitarized zone has been a way to keep the armistice and prevent tensions to rise. And I think the lesson that the whole world has gotten from this is that it has worked until now because it has kept the tensions aside. But I think the world should look at the future maybe with the idea of seeing a true change in the other side of the border, and we don't know when that is going to happen. I think Korea is an example for the world in terms of democracy, entrepreneurial spirit, and at the same time, industrial transformation. And I think that's the lesson that we take from you instead of us suggesting what should be done.
Well, thank you very much for your comments and your points of views on this matter. As you said, the signing an agreement and implementation of these agreements seems to be quite different one. We have at least the three presidents of South Korea have signed historic. Each time we were hailing that this is a historic document between South and North Korea. But these three historic agreement between the South and North Korean leaders have never been implemented. I myself was one of the first negotiators about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in 1991, when South and North Korea signed the joint declaration on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It was highly hailed by whole world's people. But there are 8 points both sides have made that Korean Peninsula will be denuclearized. But North Korea has all abrogated all these 8 points, except one thing. There is one point that both and South North Korea will never use nuclear weapons. They have not used nuclear weapons, but they have violated all the agreements, like testing or storing, deploying, transferring, receiving, etc., etc. So they have completely violated 7 points out of 8. And no agreement which were concluded between the heads of state and the leader of North Korea have never been respected. And even this very historic Panmunjom Declaration, as well as a Singapore agreement between President Trump and North Korea, have never been implemented. That's where the level of confidence has never been satisfactory at this time. So this is a really serious problem. For your case, I'm still proud that I have made some small contribution. On June 10, 2011, I visited your country to witness the signing of the Law of the Victims and Restitution, which was a very important foundation to reach a final agreement between FARC and your country. And second, on September 27, 2016, that was my last year as a Secretary General. During the signing ceremony of the peace agreement with the FARC in Cartagena, I was there, and I was very much impressed and encouraged that most of the heads of state of Latin America were present, and for support, economic and development support, the heads of World Bank, IMF, Inter-American Development Bank, and other very important leaders were present. Then lastly, I was attending in Cuba, which was initiated by President Raul Castro. There, the head of FARC leader surrendered all their arms in the presence of the Secretary General at that time. That was most impressive and reassuring moment. But as I heard from you, still you may seem to still have a problem. As you may know that we have deployed some UN missions to make sure that this agreement would be implemented. In any way, I sincerely hope that all these conflicts, or whatever remnants may be there, will be implemented as soon as possible. At the same time, we need your support for peace and security and reconciliation between South and North Korea. So this cannot be done only between South and North Korea. We need the global support, particularly support from China, Russia, Japan, United States. We have once conducted a series of 4-party talks and 6-party talks, but until now, because of North Korean positions, we have not been making any progress. This is a very sad reality at this time. But in any way, I hope that your visit to Panmunjom would really help your better appreciation on the situation on the Korean Peninsula.
And in fact, Mr. Secretary General, I had a great conversation with President Moon, and I said that Colombia was present during the war, and Colombia will always be present to support peace building, that we will always stand on your side to be helpful enough to find solutions in order to have lasting peace between Korea and North Korea. So that is one point. The second thing that you mentioned that is also very important is that I think we have advanced a lot in peace implementation. Obviously, there's a lot of constant anxiety of making things faster, but the way the process was designed was to be implemented in a course of 15 to 20 years. And we're only going to get to the 5th year by the end of 2021. Out of those 5 years, I have been implementing it for 3, and that will be 3.5 by the end of the year. Nevertheless, and this is very important, even though the agreements were signed, for example, the cornerstone that was the regional focused development plans, when I took office, there were only 2. Today we have 16. Those regional focused development plans integrate 170 municipalities. They represent something close to 6 million people, and we're talking around 11,000 counties, what we call veredas. So today, we have a roadmap, we have the resources, and we have already spent more than $200 million in works per taxes. We have created almost 800 collective productive projects, and when we took office, we had 0, and we have expanded for around 10 times what we had in individual productive projects. So that is helpful enough for the people that have left violence and are entering into a life condition of legality. But we still have also the challenge on accelerating those investments, especially because those municipalities don't necessarily have the right capabilities in order to execute resources. So we have to provide them with technical capacity and follow up with them. But for example, Mr. Secretary, we have been implementing what we call the multi-purpose national cadastre. We're updating the cadastre in Colombia. At this moment, we are going to grant 50,000 land titles by the end of the year, and we'll be the government that will grant the largest amount of land titles to peasants around the world and around the country. And we are also being able at this moment to focus on tertiary roads, access to energy. For example, people don't really know this, but when I took office, almost 1 million Colombians didn't have access to electricity. And we're about to, here's the Minister of Mines with us and Energy, we're about to close that gap by 50% just by August next year. And those things were needed in order to build lasting peace. Now, as I say, the biggest challenges that we have, and is the challenge of illegal crops, because illegal crops end up being the fuel of armed groups. So we have to use all tools at our disposal, and so that means we have to do substitution, eradication, alternative development, and those are the kinds of things we need to intervene with more pressure in order to build lasting peace. Those are the challenges we face. But I think what's also important is what has been achieved. Last year we had the lowest homicide rate in 46 years, and in 2019 the 4th lowest in 40 years. And this year we want to be even below what we were in 2019, notwithstanding that last year, since we had the lockdowns, obviously those numbers dropped. But we are committed to that. And just to mention this, Mr. Secretary General, because you were instrumental, because I know how much you did for the victims' bill. In my administration, this just happened 4 months ago, we extended the life of that bill for 10 more years in order to get reparation. And we have been the government that has granted more resources for reparation in recent Colombian history. And something that you also promoted us to do was demining. And in this 3rd year of my administration, we have already achieved almost 50% of the total demining that has been done in Colombia has been done in this administration. Those are clear commitments towards peace, and we will continue to embrace this. And let me mention something quicker from your introduction. You mentioned climate change, but people are not thinking about the conflicts that are going to be generated in the next decade due to the effects of climate change. Because we think now migration is about politics, whether you have a dictatorial regime or you have opportunities, but we're going to see migrants derived from the effects of climate change. And we're going to see more confrontations because we're going to see counties, countries, and people around the world chasing environmental assets that are being destroyed elsewhere because of the effects of climate change. So this is the moment to prevent and the moment to act.
Okay.
And that is very important in order to conciliate the idea of facing climate change and building lasting peace around the world.
That's a very good moment for us to talk something about the climate change. In fact, I was going to raise this one since you touched on climate change. As you are all aware, I think the most serious crisis is not war, it's not conflict. It is climate crisis, which whole humanity and our planet Earth are facing now. In that regard, the IPCC most recently announced, together with the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, that the initial target of keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2052 is no longer now applicable now. According to IPCC, we have already consumed out of 1.1 degrees. So 1.1 degrees Celsius has already gone up. So we have only remaining 0.4 degrees Celsius, which we may have to control until 2052. That means 30 years from now. Can we do that? That's a serious challenge. In that regard, I was very much reassured by your statement that your government will meet the 51% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and you will achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. You will plant 100 million trees, and you mentioned about Amazon River Basin as Amazon River Basin countries. I think I was so struck when I visited Amazon River Basin, rampant deforestations. As a symbol of my visit there, I planted one tree during my brief visit to Amazon River Basin. Therefore, we have to raise all possible resources and solidarity and partnership to achieve these goals set by IPCC, set by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Therefore, we need to work very much hard, but I am very much assured by your government's strong commitment. But only your government's strong commitment does not solve this problem. Exactly. All 195 state parties to this Paris Climate Change Agreement must work together. Since Colombia recently joined the OECD countries, now we are very happy that your membership, all OECD members, they have a moral and political responsibility to provide scientific and technological support together with the financial support to most of the developing countries. There's a gigantic challenges which we have to do. So now, Mr. President, let me have your vision beyond Colombia. How can you encourage Latin American countries and other developing countries, developed countries, OECD countries, to work together much faster than we have agreed upon? So there is no time left. Climate change is approaching much faster now. So we see a lot of environmental, irregularities like very serious typhoon and flooding, heat, and also wildfires. Greenland is melting, and icebergs in Arctic regions are melting, and sea level is rising. So how can we mobilize global leadership? This really matters very much, the political leadership by global leaders. Then we can mobilize businesses and also fundings. So I'd like to have your views. We have a very limited time, so maybe.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, I have to recognize that you have been a champion on the fight against the effects of climate change. When you were Secretary General, you put the issue in the eyes of the world, and you also were the advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is something that I really want to praise and recognize from your leadership. Now, the truth is that the world has been producing on an annual basis something close to 51,000 million tons of CO2 of greenhouse gases. And so far, what we have been able to do doesn't look strong enough. And the example that, for example, Bill Gates has used in his latest book is you have a bathtub, and then you have all the water running and coming out. Then at a certain point, the bathtub will fill. So far, what we have done is to try to close a little bit the amount of water that is continuously coming out. But still, there's water coming out. And that means that what we have been is delaying the moment in where we will get a moment of no return. So that's why the challenge of how is it that we can get to zero emissions, and that's more complicated because every single human activity comes with emissions per se, is how can we really mitigate that challenge? And in the case of a country like Colombia, Colombia only represents, Mr. Secretary General, 0.6% of all the global CO2 emissions. But still, we are one of the top 20 countries more affected by the effects of climate change. So we have seen deteriorations in our snowy mountains that have been losing that snow coverage, and that's affecting the water sources. We have seen more flooding. And for example, last year, for the first time in history, we were hit by a hurricane category 5 in the island of San Andres, San Providencia, and Santa Catalina, and those islands. So we're threatened. Now, what is the example that Colombia can set? And that's why we're going to Glasgow and say, even though we are 0.6% of all the global greenhouse gases emissions, we want to get a reduction of 51% by 2030. So if a country that is not a rich country, that needs to have more development, it's saying that even though it only represents 0.6%, it's going to get to 51% reduction, it's a call for action from the biggest emitters of CO2. And now we have to value the ethics of how we invest. And you saw that when I gave my speech today, that for a long time, investment has been based on where is it cheaper to invest. And sometimes the decision of investing where it's cheaper is not necessarily the most sustainable, because where you have cheaper labor force, at the same time, you have less compromised, sustainable energy or productive policies. So now, for example, when I make this case, and I show that a country like Colombia has one of the cleanest energy matrix, investing in Colombia and producing in Colombia, it's more responsible in terms of sustainability than going to other places where it's cheaper. If we get that conscience on investing wise, focused, and at the same time sustainable, I think this is going to generate another ethical behavior from countries and from industries. But if you ask me what is the number one thing we need to do, is accelerate energy transition is going to be decisive. The way we consume as well. Because now we have to look at poultry and cattle sectors to behave in a more responsible way. That's why, for example, silvopastures are so important, because they also capture CO2, and you have more rotation less land, intensive use of land. It's part of the ethics that we need. And also, how do we reduce our individual carbon footprint? The way we eat, the way we consume energy, the way we drive, the way we move. Those are part of the ethics, and that's why we're about to present before Congress a climate action bill in order to put in place that goal of reducing by 51% our emissions towards 2030 and becoming a carbon neutral country by 2050. And that means commitments from the transportation sector, from the industrial sector, from the environmental sector, so we are all combined. And if a country like Colombia is doing it, we need to see the big emitters to do the same. Now, is it going to be easy? No, it is not. Because in those countries that already have a tradition of producing cheaper, and they are heavily intensive on certain fuels and certain energy sources, once you start making the transformation, and if you're doing too fast, you're going to see more unrest, more protest, more people that are absurdly negating the existence of climate change. But that takes bravery from many leaders that have been the leaders of the countries that have been the big emitters. I think that is the great challenge now, and is going to be the challenge in the next decade, Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your strong commitment. I hope we have more political leaders like yourself around the world, because you are very much committed. You said that the 51% emission cut by 2030. Now, I understand that Korean government is now talking about, it has not yet enacted, they are now going to make it a law to cut at least 35% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. But I'm speaking out that we should do more, and we should make sure that, as President Moon Jae-in has declared already many times, that we should have carbon neutrality, 100% neutrality. Now that means 0% emission by 2050. Now, as you said, the mitigation is very important, but I think we need to be wise enough to invest more on adaptation. Adaptation will have a much better and bigger benefits. There are still very good scientific technologies like carbon capture, storages, etc., and also some the nuclear energies. So there should be very reasonable, scientific-based energy mix using this renewable energy, as well as I think other nuclear energy, etc. So in any way, I see that there's a sign that we may have to finish by 6 o'clock, but it's already 5 minutes past. But in any way, Mr. President, we have been very much inspired by your leadership, and I'm sure that through your visit, bilateral relationship between Korea and Colombia will be further strengthened, but that is not enough. I think we have to work together as a global leader, that we have to make sure that all sustainable development goals and Paris climate change agreement should be fully and completely realized, so that our humanity can live sustainably with our planet. That is your political as well as moral responsibility. I'm now having only moral responsibility, but you have a political and moral responsibility. And therefore, I wish you continued good success, and let's work together to make this world better for all. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you so much.
law. Dear Excellencies, thank you so much for your powerful and clear message.